Well, God bless you and greeting in the name of Jesus Christ. This is Christian Virtual Fellowship, a production of Allegiance to the King, an online church. Allegiance to the King can be found at allegiancetotheking.org and also on Facebook. My name is Raymond Scott. Today, I'd like to offer a tribute to Brother Andrew, God's Smuggler. Andrew Vander Bilge is a great example, and we're going to get into it today to show you why. This presentation is in honor of Andrew Vander Bilge, who passed away last week at the age of 94. He was known as Brother Andrew, a subject and an author of several books. Brother Andrew was called God's smuggler because he smuggled in thousands of Bibles to Protestant and Orthodox churches, which struggled to stay active in communist countries. He illegally brought in Bibles, which the communists called pornography and propaganda. He risked arrest, torture, and imprisonment to sneak Bibles into the hands of ministers and believers. His devotion to serving the body of Christ was heroic and transformative for many Christians stuck under communist rule. His devotion was based on trust. I wish to show you some instances of his trusting God while being in different and difficult situations. I offer these instances to inspire us all to trust God more in our everyday life. But first, I want to give some historical context. In 1945, World War II ended with a divided Europe. Countries in Central Europe, which is shown in pink, were torn away from the Nazis and occupied by the Soviet Union, which is shown in red. Communist Russians. Western Europe was occupied by American, British, and French armies. Putting it simply, the continent was divided between elected governments wanting liberty and other governments promising a man-made utopia while oppressing their own people. In 1947, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared that an iron curtain was drawn closed by the Russian communists and the communist parties of several Central European countries. The term Iron Curtain had been coined by George Orwell, the author of the book 1984. A Cold War was declared by Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, the Russian communists. The Communist Party promised to build a utopia, a perfect world with the blood and sweat of its people. Instead, it brought a hell on earth, killing tens of millions of its own. Communism denied the very existence of God, calling religion the opiate of the masses. Human rights such as freedom of worship, speech, assembly, and association were given lip service but denied to the people. The communists sought to spread their gospel by any means necessary, peacefully or by war. Wars between the communists and non-communists were fought all over the world, with the US and the Soviet Union taking sides. Both sides argued their worldviews and fought to promote and defend them. As a part of their atheistic worldview, communist countries made illegal the publishing, selling, and buying of the Holy Bible. Ministers of churches could not speak freely to their congregations, but had to go to the government to have their sermons approved. References to creation, miracles, and spiritual matters were discouraged, if not prohibited. Police agents would be in the church pews listening to ensure compliance, and would arrest and torture church leaders. As an aside, Even today in China, communists have taken crosses off the top of thousands of church steeples despite peaceful protests. Inside churches, crosses and crucifixes have been torn down and replaced by portraits of dictator Xi Jinping. The government has reserved the right to appoint church leaders, and home churches are illegal. The state religion of China is loyalty, obedience, and love for the Communist Party of China. In the 1940s, a young man named Andrew Vanderbilt had grown up in a small village in Holland during the Nazi occupation. He knew what it was like not to have freedom. German soldiers controlled almost all aspects of life for the Dutch civilians. Dutch farmers had to give their crops to the German army and watch their own families starve. After the war, Andrew looked for adventure by joining the Dutch army and fought for Holland to retain its colony of Indonesia. Before he left for the East Indies, his mother had given him a Bible to read, but he ignored it. He fought both communists and nationalists and was deeply scarred by the horrors of war. He was also wounded, shot through the right ankle, and found himself going home disillusioned about the glory of fighting for one's country. While he was in a hospital ward, recovering with 19 other wounded soldiers, a young woman arrived inviting them all to take a bus to a Christian revival meeting. All 20 men got dressed up and boarded the bus. Andrew and a friend shared a bottle of gin on the way. With their bottle of booze, they took seats in the rear of the tent. The 20 young soldiers in civilian clothes took their seats. Andrew and his friend finished the bottle of gin. The service began when a man with deep-set eyes and a narrow face took the podium and announced there were 2 people in the tent that were bound by powers they could not control. He prayed passionately for the 2, calling them our brothers, over whom foreign spirits have gained influence. Andrew burst out laughing loudly. His friend joined him in laughter, and they were still whooping with laughter when the opening hymn ended. Andrew had no idea how disruptive his and Pierre's behavior was until the preacher said, "Brothers and sisters, we have 2 men here tonight who are chained by the powers of a dark world." The man then began to pray out loud for Andrew and Pierre. As the man prayed, Andrew tried to control his laughter until his sides hurt. Finally, he lost the battle and was soon laughing louder than ever, so loud, in fact, that he drowned out the man's prayer. Andrew watched in drunken delight as the obviously frustrated man gave up his prayer and told the choir to sing. The choir stood to its feet and began to sing the song, "Let My People Go." When the choir reached the chorus to the song, everyone in the tent joined in the singing. Now, Andrew and Pierre were laughing uncontrollably. In fact, Andrew could not recall a time when he had laughed so much. It felt good to laugh, even if the laughter was alcohol-induced. The choir sang on through the second verse of the song, but when the audience again joined in for the chorus, Andrew noticed a curious thing. As they belted out, "Let my people go," the words suddenly had a sobering effect on him. Andrew stopped laughing and listened to the words being sung around him. But instead of hearing, "Let my people go," Andrew seemed to be hearing, "Let me go," as though it were Andrew addressing some force outside of himself. Andrew sat silently on the bus ride back to the hospital, contemplating the words of the song. What could they mean? And why had they seemed to speak to him? The following morning, Andrew awoke with a hangover, But he also awoke with something else, a deep desire to read his mother's Bible. All that day, he carried the Bible with him, reading it whenever he had a spare moment. And much to his surprise, he wanted to read more the following day and the day after that. Soon he had set himself a schedule to help guide him systematically through the whole Bible. Andrew's release from the Army and the Rehabilitation Center came in November 1949. The Dutch government gave Andrew a small severance allotment along with his discharge papers. Andrew used the money to buy a bicycle. The weeks of rehabilitation therapy had improved the strength in his right leg, but he still had a long way to go if he was to walk without a limp. Andrew decided that riding the bike around would both help to strengthen his leg. Since Andrew had nowhere else to go after his release from the hospital and the Army, he went back to St. Pancras and moved in with his father. Although Andrew did not have a job, he did have a way to fill his days. He went to church, one service every night and two on Sundays. Some of the services were at the Reformed Church in St. Pancras, while others, such as the Salvation Army service in Alkmaar and the Baptist prayer meeting in Amsterdam, were a long bike ride. Andrew did not care what denomination people belonged to, as long as they believed the Bible and wanted to have fellowship with him. So Andrew had been freed from the kingdom of darkness by the power of the gospel music. And once freed from the drink, he became hungry for the meat of the scriptures. He felt an overwhelming desire to discover the God of the Bible and how he fit into God's creation. His spiritual journey began. In 1953, Andrew decided to attend a school in Glasgow, Scotland, called Worldwide Evangelization Crusade Missionary Training College. Despite a weak grasp on speaking English and his girlfriend telling him she would dump him, he pondered the matter. Should he just evangelize at home? Should he go? Then from the college, he received a cable. There were no vacancies at the Scottish campus. He would have to wait until next year, 1954. Despite the cable, his girlfriend, and little English, he went to God about the matter. Having learned from recent experiences the voice of God, he heard the word go. With just enough money for fare to London, where the college headquarters was, and the tuition fee for the first semester, he left his job and kissed his family goodbye. Arriving in London, he quickly found out that his English lessons back home were woefully inadequate. He couldn't adequately ask for directions or understand what directions were given. A small miracle he found: the college headquarters building, one that was in bad need of a new paint job. Once there, a man there who spoke Dutch asked him if he had received the cable about there being no vacancies. Andrew said yes. The man smiled and said, "And you came anyhow?" Andrew said, "A place will open when the time comes. I am certain of it. I want to be ready." The man excused himself and then returned a couple of minutes later. Andrew could stay at the headquarters for a while on condition he would work. So for 2 months, Andrew worked very hard learning English, and he painted the headquarters building. He was a diligent painter, not taking time to watch the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, although everyone there urged him to. After 2 months, in June 1953, an elderly Christian man and his bedridden wife took Andrew into their London home. It was to be for only a couple of days. While there, Andrew mopped the floor, washed and dried and ironed the laundry, and cooked dinner. This is what he would have done at home in Holland. The couple was so impressed by his work ethic, they asked for him to stay until school started. Then a letter from Glasgow came about a vacancy opening up. He was admitted to start that fall as he originally applied for. Finally, September 1953 came around, and with one semester of tuition in hand, he started at the Evangelist College. His learning to trust God for everything he needed at college was about to start. And now I'm going to read some excerpts from his autobiography, God's Smuggler. And while I'm doing that, I will turn on the light so I can see what I'm reading. There we go. The first semester sped by. The weeks passed so fast that soon it came time for me to hand out on the first of several training trips in evangelism. You're going to like this, Andy, said Mr. Dinnan. It's an exercise in trust. The rules are simple. Each student on your team is given a £1 banknote. With that, you go out on a missionary tour through Scotland. You're expected to pay your own transportation, your own lodging, your food, any advertising you want to do, the renting of halls, providing refreshments, all on a £1 banknote? Worse than that, when you get back to school after 4 weeks, you're expected to pay back the pound. I laughed. Sounds like we'll be passing the hat all the time. Oh, you're not allowed to take up collections. Never. You're not to mention money at any of your meetings. All of your needs have got to be provided without any manipulation on your part, or the experiment is a failure. I was a member of a team of 5 boys. Later, when I tried to reconstruct where our funds came from during those 4 weeks, it was hard to do. It seemed that what we needed was always just there. Sometimes a letter would arrive from one of the boys' parents with a little money. Sometimes we would get a check in the mail from a church we had visited days or weeks earlier. The notes that came with these gifts were always interesting. I know you don't need money, or you would have mentioned it, someone would write. But God just wouldn't let me get to sleep tonight until I put this in an envelope for you. Contributions frequently came in the form of produce. In one little town in the Highlands of Scotland, we were given 600 eggs. We had eggs for breakfast, eggs for lunch, eggs as hors d'oeuvres before a dinner of eggs, with an egg white meringue dessert. It was weeks before we could look a chicken in the eye. But money or produce, we stuck fast to 2 rules. We never mentioned a need aloud, and we gave away a tithe of whatever came to us as soon as we got it, within 24 hours if possible. There were times before the end of the tour, however, when it looked as though the experiment was failing. One weekend, we were holding meetings in Edinburgh. We'd attracted a large group of young people the first day and were casting about for a way to get them to come back the next. Suddenly, without consulting anyone, one of the team members stood up and made an announcement. Before the meeting tomorrow evening, we would like you all to have tea with us here, 4 o'clock. How many think they can make it? A couple dozen hands went up, and we were committed. At first, instead of being delighted, the rest of us were horrified. All of us knew that we had no tea, no cake, no bread and butter, and exactly 5 cups. Nor did we have money to buy these things. Our last penny had gone to rent the hall. This was going to be a real test of God's care. And for a while, it looked as though He was going to provide everything through the young people themselves. After the meeting, several of them came forward and said they would like to help. One offered milk, another half pound of tea, another sugar. One girl even offered to bring dishes. Our tea was rapidly taking shape, but there was one thing still missing: the cake. Without cake, these Scottish boys and girls wouldn't consider tea tea. So that night in our evening prayer time, we put the matter before God. Lord, we've got ourselves into a spot. From somewhere we've got to get a cake. Will you help us? That night, as we rolled up in our blankets on the floor of the hall, we played guessing games. How was God going to give us that cake? Among the five of us, we guessed everything imaginable, or so we thought. Morning arrived. We half expected a heavenly messenger to come to our door bearing a cake, but no one came. The morning mail arrived. We ripped open the 2 letters, hoping for money, but there was none. A woman from a nearby church came by to see if she could help. Cake was on the tip of all of our tongues, but we swallowed the word and shook our heads. Everything, we assured her, is in God's hands. The tea had been announced for 4 o'clock in the afternoon. By 3, the tables were set, but still we had no cake. 3:30 came. We put on water to boil. 3:45, and then the doorbell rang. All of us together ran to the big front entrance, and there was the postman. In his hand was a large box. "Hello, lad," said the postman. "Got something for you that feels like a food package." He handed the box to one of the boys. The delivery day is over, actually," he said, "but I hate to leave a perishable package overnight." We thanked him profusely, and the minute he closed the door, the boy solemnly handed the box to me. "It's for you, Andrew, from a Mrs. William Hopkins in London." And that's the bedridden wife of the Christian man that he lived with for 3 months in London. He took the package and carefully unwrapped it. Off came the twine. Off came the brown outside paper. Inside there was no note, only a large white box. Deep in my soul, I knew that I could afford the drama of lifting the lid slowly. As I did, there in perfect condition, to be admired by 5 sets of wondering eyes, was an enormous, glistening, moist chocolate cake. With this kind of experience behind me, I was not really surprised to find waiting for me when we got back to school a check from the wet straws that was exactly enough, when converted into pounds, to pay my second term's fee. So that's an excellent example of how Andrew trusted the Lord to provide for him in the field and also for his personal need to continue working. So let's go back to sharing the screen. A part of the training program was to preach the gospel on the streets of the city. Andrew went to share the gospel in one of the worst areas of Glasgow, Scotland, a slum called Patrick, which had such a reputation for violence that even policemen would not walk its streets alone. But because Andrew believed that this was where God wanted him to go, off he went to Patrick. He could scarcely believe the condition of the place the first time he saw it. Everything was dark and dank. The bulbs in the streetlights were broken or had been stolen, and rotting garbage was piled everywhere in the streets. Children with runny noses and draped in threadbare rags eyed him suspiciously as he made his way along the street, carrying a pile of gospel tracts. Andrew never encountered a place like this in Holland. The Dutch penchant for order and cleanliness would never allow such a place to exist. On the corner of each block were smoke-filled pubs where glassy-eyed men sat getting drunk, usually spending their family's food money on cheap whiskey. Andrew went into the pubs and asked the proprietors if he could hand out tracts in their establishment. None of them refused, and Andrew went about giving away tracts to the pub patrons and talking to anyone he could strike up a conversation with. And here's a picture of the oldest pub in Glasgow, established in 1792. And so I'm certain it was open at the time that Brother Andrew was there. Although I'm not certain if that's in the Patrick neighborhood or not. At one pub, Andrew met a man named Jack Kearney. Jack was totally drunk, but he took one of the tracts and asked Andrew to visit him at his house the following evening. Andrew agreed to do that, and the next evening, he and Albert, one of his friends from the training school, made their way up 4 flights of stairs to Jack's apartment. As with the streetlights outside, the light bulbs that lit the stairway had been either broken or stolen. Andrew and Albert were forced to pick their way up the stairs in total darkness, trying their best to avoid the broken beer bottles on the steps. The 2 men located the door to the apartment and knocked. Jack opened the door, and Andrew could clearly see that he was still drunk. Jack's eyes were glazed, he wobbled on his feet, and his breath stank of stale whiskey. "Come in," Jack said, motioning Andrew and Albert in. Inside, the apartment was dingy, lit by a single light bulb. The wallpaper was stained brown and peeling off the walls, and the paint was peeling from the ceiling. Moldering bread crusts and scraps of food were spread about the kitchen table and counter, and the sink was piled high with dirty dishes. "Let me fix you a cup of tea," Jack said. And with that, he turned and pulled 3 dirty cups from the sink. He did not bother to wash them. He just rubbed them with a stained dish towel. Andrew and Albert looked at each other, their eyes wide, but they did not say a word. Andrew knew it would be insulting to turn down Jack's offer of a cup of tea, even if the cups weren't clean. Several minutes later, Jack laid 3 cups full of tea on the table. As they sipped the tea, the 3 men talked with Jack, asking Andrew question after question about his life in Holland and his experiences in Indonesia. "So, Dutchman, since you were in the army, tell me, what's the first law of war?" Jack finally asked. Andrew thought for a moment and then lifted his eyes to stare into Jack's stubbled face. "It's your life or mine. That's the law of war, Jack," he said. "Right, you're exactly right," Jack said. With that, he pushed himself away from the table, walked to the sideboard behind Andrew, opened a drawer, and pulled something out. It was a cutthroat razor. Jack flicked the razor open, spun around, and held the razor to Andrew's throat. "And I'm going to kill you," he said. Albert sat across the table from Andrew, who could see that his friend was too petrified to do anything but pray. Meanwhile, Andrew thought fast. He had no doubt that Jack, in his drunken condition, was well capable of slitting his throat with the razor. "You're right, Jack. It is my life or yours. But because of that, you can't do this. Someone has already died to save your life and mine. His name is Jesus Christ." Andrew felt Jack press the razor harder to his neck. He felt the sharp blade nicking the skin at his throat. "Jack, Jesus came into the world because of these laws of war and because of the spiritual warfare where only one man can win, and the other lose," Andrew continued. "One has to die so that the other will live. And that's what Jesus Christ did. He died so that you might live, Jack." Jack held completely still for a moment. Andrew's heart thumped in his chest as he waited to see what Jack would do. Would he let Jack go or slit his throat? Much to his relief, Andrew felt Jack release the pressure on the razor and move it away from his throat. Jack stepped back, closed the razor, and dropped it in the drawer. When a drunken, murderous man with a cutthroat razor threatened to kill Andrew, Andrew did not forget about who put him there in the first place. Jesus Christ, the head of the church, became the topic. Andrew turned the focus not to himself by begging for mercy or shifting the blame to Jack's many flaws. Andrew brought into Jack's blurry focus Jesus, the man who died for everyone, so that all who believe can live. Thinking quickly, Andrew said, "Thank you for putting the razor away, Jack. We'll be on our way now, but I'll come back and talk some more with you about Jesus." Jack nodded silently as Andrew and Albert headed out of the apartment and down the darkened stairs as fast as they could. They were both ashen-faced and shaking by the time they made it out into the streets. The following evening, Andrew went back to see Jack, though this time he decided not to take Albert with him. In fear and trepidation, Andrew made his way back up the stairs to Jack's apartment. He knocked gingerly on the door. Jack opened it, and much to Andrew's relief, although he looked terrible, with big black rings under his eyes, Jack was not drunk. "I'm sorry about last night," Jack apologized. "It was a terrible thing to do to you." "It's the alcohol. It makes me do terrible things." "That's okay, Jack. I understand," Andrew said as he stepped inside Jack's apartment. "You know, Jesus still loves you, Jack. He really does. Why don't you pray and ask him to come into your life and change it?" Andrew continued. Much to Andrew's surprise, Jack sank to his knees in the kitchen and began pouring his heart out to God, asking him to forgive him and change his life. "I'm a really bad person, Jesus, but I really do want to follow you. Please forgive me and accept me," Jack prayed. That night, when Andrew left Jack's apartment, he almost floated down the darkened stairs. Jack Kearney, the hard-drinking Scotsman from the slums who wanted to slit Andrew's throat, had become a Christian. Andrew visited Jack several more times, and each time he left the apartment, he was amazed at the changes taking place in Jack. God had really touched and changed Jack's life. This incident was as frightful as it would not be the last time Andrew's own personal safety would be put at risk while serving the Lord. What Brother Andrew is most well known for is his smuggling Bibles into communist countries. That is why I started with an explanation of what the political situation was then. Europe was divided by the communists. Let's see one example of how Andrew trusted God to provide Bibles to Christians behind the Iron Curtain. And here's a photograph of Brother Andrew with his VW Beetle. I wonder if the Beetle has Bibles in it. It very well may. Just ahead was the Yugoslav border. For the first time in my life, I was about to enter a communist country on my own, instead of in a group invited or sponsored by the government. I stopped the little VW on the outskirts of the Austrian village and took stock. The Yugoslav government in 1957 permitted visitors to bring in only articles for their personal use. Anything new or anything in quantity was suspect because of the black market thriving all over the country. Printed material especially was liable to be confiscated at the border, no matter how small the quantity, because coming from out of the country, it was regarded as foreign propaganda. Now here I was with the luggage, literally bulging with tracts, Bibles, and portions of Bibles. How was I to get them past the border guard? And so, for the first of many times, I said the prayer of God's smuggler. Okay, let's see if I can see the whole thing here. Lord, in my luggage, I have scripture that I want to take to your children across this border. When you were on earth, you made blind eyes see. Now I pray, make seeing eyes blind. Do not let the guards see those things which you do not want them to see. So armed with this prayer, I started the motor and drove up to the barrier. The two guards appeared both startled and pleased to see me. I wondered how much business came their way. From the way they stared at my passport, it might have been the first Dutch one they had ever seen. There were just a few formalities to attend to, they assured me in German, and I could be on my way. One of the guards started poking around in my camping gear. In the corners and folds of my sleeping bag and tent were boxes of tracts. Lord, make those seeing eyes blind. The guard says, do you have anything to declare? Well, I have my money and a wristwatch and a camera. The other guard, looking inside the VW, he asked me to take out a suitcase. I knew that there were tracts scattered among my clothing. Of course, sir, I said. I pulled the front seat forward and pulled the suitcase out. I placed it on the ground and opened the lid. The guard lifted the shirts that lay on top. Beneath them, and now in plain sight, was a pile of tracts in two Yugoslavian languages, Croatian and Slavian. How was God going to handle this situation? It seems dry for this time of year, I said to the other guard. And without looking at the other fellow who was inspecting the suitcase, I fell into a conversation about the weather. I told him about my own homeland and how it was always wet on the polders. Finally, when I could stand the suspense no longer, I looked behind me. The first guard wasn't even glancing at the suitcase. He was listening to our conversation. When I turned around, he caught himself and looked up. Well then, do you have anything else to declare? Only small things, I said. Well, the tracts were small after all. We don't bother with them, said the guard. He nodded to me that he could close the suitcase and with a little salute, handed me back my passport. So that was one episode and his first one of crossing into a communist country with Bibles and tracts. And here in plain sight were the tracts of the gospel, easy to see by the guard in his suitcase. And yet somehow they just didn't take note of it. On another journey from Bulgaria to Romania, both of which were communist countries, Brother Andrew came to a border crossing into Romania. Andrew pulled the car to a stop at the border. He had just crossed the Danube River from Bulgaria and was waiting to enter Romania. 4 cars were stopped in front of him, and Andrew was relieved. Surely it will take only a few minutes to get across the Romanian border, he thought. He soon found out how wrong his assessment was. 40 minutes later, the border guards were still inspecting the first car. When finally they waved that car on, the next car in line pulled up to the barrier. The guards then set to work inspecting it. An hour later, everything inside the car had been meticulously spread out on the ground, along with the car seats and the hubcaps. The guards were now busy taking apart the engine. Andrew stuffed his hands into his pockets and tried to look unfazed. though his heart was jumping through his chest. He had crossed the border into communist countries numerous times before, but this was the first time he had seen anything like this. What about my cargo, those precious Bibles, Andrew thought. If the guards stripped his car, they would be sure to find the contraband items. The Bibles would be taken from him and he would end up in a Romanian prison, with no one from the outside knowing where he was. It was a heavy price to pay, but with God's help, Andrew hoped to smuggle the Bibles right under the guards' watchful eyes. Andrew did what he always did when facing such situations. He prayed silently about it. Then he took the exact opposite of what would seem to be the best chance of getting the Bibles over the border. Instead of keeping them hidden in the back seat of his car, he pulled out several of the Bibles and piled them beside him on the front seat, where the border guards would be sure to see them. Finally, 4 hours after Andrew had pulled to a stop, a guard waved him forward. Finally, it was his turn. Andrew drove the car forward and stopped in front of the barrier. He rolled down the window and handed his passport to the guard. His heart pounded as the guard looked at the passport and then wrote something down on a piece of paper. Finally, the guard looked inside the car, right where the Bibles were stacked on the front seat. Then, much to Andrew's surprise and relief, the guard handed the passport and waved him on into Romania. There are many other instances of God working with Brother Andrew, and time doesn't permit going into them here and now. I highly recommend God's Smuggler by Brother Andrew of John and Elizabeth Sherrill. There's also on Kindle a book called Brother Andrew, God's Secret Agent. And I have used portions of both of those. Brother Andrew once said, "The real calling is not a certain place or career, but to everyday obedience. And that call is extended to every Christian, not just a select few." Those are certainly wise words. So to conclude, nothing Andrew believed for was contrary to God's purpose. His trust was for the purpose of furthering the gospel. What Andrew did was for a specific time in history. However, there are still countries in which Christians are actively persecuted, and they could use our prayers and aid. Andrew consciously violated the laws of several countries because the laws were on their face, were in direct contradiction to the expressed will of God, and were intended to harm God's people. Andrew had a big picture view of Christianity. He saw people of many denominations as brothers and sisters. Well, here are applications that came to my mind, and perhaps you can add to them. One is that one should not violate the laws of the land just because they are disagreeable. If one acts in violation of the clear, ungodly law, it must be done peacefully, knowing that arrest and imprisonment are possible. We can smuggle God's gospel message into people's minds by sharing the gospel and our testimonies, inviting them to fellowship and showing our love for them. And I recommend his autobiography instead of books written by others about him. They're very powerful words. So this is a tribute to Brother Andrew. It certainly didn't cover even a fifth of the stories in the book about him. I am thankful to God for people like him who put their necks out on the line to further the gospel message of the kingdom. And I thank you for listening. You have a great day. Okay. Well, how are we doing?
Good.
Yeah.
That was a mouthful.
Yeah, come on here. Such a timely share, Ray. Super encouraging, just really cool to hear how God worked. I haven't read the book. I'm like, as you were finishing up there, I was like, I'm going to pick that up on Audible right now. But
Great idea.
yeah, I really liked it's just daily obedience, just daily walking in the will of God. And so that's what I want to strive for and see him doing things in our lives that way as well. So thank you for sharing that. Great testimony, great, what's the word? A great testament to his life.
Yes, thank you. And I noticed that several people have put up tributes in honor of him. And I haven't watched any of them, but I'm sure that they cover some of the same material. We have someone that is DLC 579. You have John, first, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
I was going to say that's Donna Catuli, DLC 579. I was just going to say real quick that he, I'm glad you did this tribute, because he certainly deserves it. He was quite a man of God, and very, very inspirational early in my Christian life. I read God's Smuggler many, many, many years ago, not too long after I became serious about my Christian faith anyway. And it was a big inspiration. And I've read one of his other books, which is called For the Love of My Brothers, that is every bit as good, if not even better. The God Smuggler runs up through about the mid to late 60s. And then For the Love of My Brothers picks up from there and runs through the 1970s and 1980s, maybe part of the 1990s as well. And in the 70s, he was bringing Bibles into Africa, into countries that were very dangerous, and to Christians especially. And then in the 1980s, he was bringing Bibles into China, into communist China. And some of the stories from the Bible smuggling into China, I mean, I don't know how to describe them other than they monumentally miraculous. Parting of the Red Sea kinds of events.
Wow.
So they're if you've never read any of Brother Andrew's books, you are definitely missing out, and you should do exactly what Jackson is doing and get a copy of God's Smuggler right away and read it, and you'll definitely want to read his other books.
Okay, Donna.
Yeah, I'm glad John spoke. My beginning walk with the Lord, I had read God's Smugglers, and For the Love of My Brother, I read another one, The Walk of Brother Andrews, and I was always fascinated with George Mueller is another one, and yet these aren't magic tricks that these guys are doing. They're called of God in their decade, in their age, and George was in the 1800s, but the Lord is the Lord. This is the 21st century, and it's exciting to see how he would work today. And I love to read anything that has to do with people in third world countries who have just miraculous testimonies. I don't want to say that, God has delivered everybody, because then we see the opposite coin of Christians being beheaded and murdered. But these men and women, Corrie ten Boom is another. I read her biography and I was so awed. In my very beginning years, I think it was very impressionable that I was so attracted to men and women that were heroes of the faith. It's like the Hebrews 11 stuff, heroes of the faith in my eyes, to set me up to be able to have some trust in the provision of the Lord, because I was about to leave my home. I didn't have a husband, and I found myself in tight places. Went on a few missionary trips and absolutely did see phenomenal power that did not originate from me, did not come from me, just to get me in a place where I could learn to trust God and, and learn how to see his faithfulness. And of course, my heart was evangelism and to touch people's heart, still is to this day. But, tonight's Holy Spirit night. So I thought, how apropos, to see the hand of God in the miraculous when God wants it done, not when I think I should do it because I'd fall in a hole because I wasn't listening to the Lord, and get eaten by the lion. That can happen because it's not something that I'm not listening or called of God to do a specific thing. So we don't want to get that mixed. We don't want to get that skewed. I am just always amazed at the generosity, the simplicity of these men and women's lives, and how in the world they had a heart to trust God in the dangerous situations that, for my mind, is mind-boggling. I mean, I grow to appreciate them. I'm like, I feel like such a weenie, in comparison, but just reading about them, admiring them, and watching how big God's heart is to choose simple men and women ordained to be evangelistic and go into dangerous territories, foreign countries, and make their mark to spread the gospel, even by, dropping off Bibles in that language. I am amazed. Thank you so much, Ray, for bringing this, to our minds today. I just think it's perfect. It's just it's perfect for today.
And and then I think to myself, okay, so when I'm in an elevator and God tells me, go ahead and say something to the person next to you. Why would I be afraid to do that? I mean, when you compare that to what Brother Andrew and so many others like Corrie ten Boom and others have
Amazing.
done, so it is very inspirational, and I'm inspired by it. Well, anyway, if that's the end of the comments, I'll stop the recording. And again, Allegiance to the King. You can find us on Facebook and allegiancetotheking.org. Thank you for joining us today, and God bless you.